I am glad to be here today with Brad Onishi, fellow scholar in the area of religion and the author of an absolutely extraordinary book called Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. Brad and I have never had a chance to do anything together. And so, Brad, thank you for engaging in this conversation today.
Thanks for inviting me, and it is great to get to meet and talk and discuss, and even if we're talking about kind of difficult things.
Um, Brad, one of the things that was most striking to me about your book was your personal backstory and your connection to a zealous white evangelicalism that at the time, because I lived zealous white evangelicalism too, right? And I think a lot of authors in this space did, right? Um, and at the time, it seemed wholesome. It seemed life-giving to a lot of us for a while, at least. Um, but in your book, you expose the racism and the white supremacism and the nationalism and the toxicity that we see erupt on January 6th and is with us now. You seem to trace the heart of the story to the early 1960s. That's how your kind of story of origins. Does that would you is that where you would like to tell the beginning of the story of kind of what goes wrong with conservative white Christianity in America, or would you tell the story? I mean, is there a way to tell the story with a longer time horizon? How do you like to narrate that?
Oh yeah, no, there's definitely a long horizon, and I think we can look at Anthea Butler's book, White Evangelical Racism. We can look at Gorski and Perry, Flag and the Cross, and I think those books, along with many others, convince us, hey, we've got a long history of this, and your book really gives us a multinational, global perspective and historical understanding of rising authoritarianism, et cetera. For me to start in the 1960s was a very, I think, neat and tidy way for me to say, hey, I converted to evangelicalism in the 1990s. And the evangelicalism I converted to, in many ways, was a product of the 1960s. So if the 1960s were broadly a time of progress and change in the country with many hiccups and backsteps, then for many white evangelicals, they were the time that the country lost its way. So one of the reasons it started in the 1960s is that so many evangelicals will tell you, well, that's when the country lost its way. Yeah. So I think for us, the question is, well, why do they keep saying that? And it's like, oh, well, because of what they say to be the sexual revolution and the breakup of the nuclear family and the normalization of queer, life and representation. But my point is also, well, yeah, but the 60s also included the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, immigration reform, the publication of the feminist mystique, Stonewall as a kind of landmark moment, the Loving case, which made interracial marriage okay for everyone in all 50 states. And I can go on and on all day, right? So I think the 60s are a really fascinating way to start, but by no means the only place to start.
In my book, I also identify the 60s as a pivotal turning point in evoking a ferocious counterreaction on the part of many conservative Christians. Counter-revolution, and you use the language and find the language of counter-revolution in some of the sources that you're digging around in. And one of the things I found strangely encouraging about your book is it really seemed to track with my own thesis that the 60s was experienced by some folks, at least, as a cultural revolution that required a ferocious counter-revolution. And in a sense, we've been living with the counter-revolutionary energy since at least Goldwater, 1964. By the way, as a history and politics buff myself, I was so struck by your centering your story in Orange County and beginning in a way with the Goldwater campaign of 1964. That was fascinating. And then you were able to draw the links of like the figures like Richard Viguerie and Paul Weyrich. I had no idea that Paul Weyrich and Viguerie were there on the ground with Goldwater in 64, because I mean, I'm old enough. I knew or encountered some of these guys or the people who were succeeding them in the 90s, you know. So you trace that story back to the 60s. Um, so my question for you is the idea that ferocious cultural changes need an equally ferocious counter-revolution. How much of that was ginned up by, as one point in the book, you called them like political mercenaries? And how much of it was like the really heartfelt feeling of regular everyday folks in their living rooms and swimming pools in Orange County?
So I think it's a good question. I think, look, I don't want to overlook the fact that change leads people to feel uncomfortable. Okay. So I understand. I have a 2-year-old daughter. We had to change her daycare recently. It's taken her a long time to adjust. It's not easy. And it's not easy for me as her dad to take her there and have her cry her eyes out every time I leave her because she misses her old daycare and she's uncomfortable and all that business. Okay. I get it. But I think there's 2 points. I think one is change that helps liberate people from oppression is one that a lot of people can recognize as really necessary. So I think that's one point. I think another point is that a lot of the outrage and the fear and the anxiety about what's happening in the United States around you can be ginned up. It can be ignited. And we see that today. I mean, if people are like, well, how does that work? Well, it's like, well, what do you think happens today? I live very close to San Francisco. I teach in San Francisco. Every time somebody wants to throw a negative comment on my YouTube or my podcast feed, it's all about how San Francisco is the worst place ever. And whenever I ask them about that, I'm like, so how do you know? And they're like, well, I watch Fox News and they show me that there's break-ins or there's looters. And I'm like, okay, great. Because here's my picture of what I taught today. I can see the Pacific Ocean. It's beautiful. There's a nice little restaurant I'm sitting at. And here's my point is we can get to a place where we are revved up in terms of our anxiety and fear. And I would argue that happened in the 60s. It happened in the 70s, and it has not stopped happening. So the counter revolution you're talking about, I think some of it is a lot of change in the United States. But I don't have sympathy for people who are not willing to see that change as one that helps a more just society. And 2, I think it's a result in some cases of political midwives seizing on fear in order to accomplish political goals. And, this leads me to a question for you, which is like, how does this look in other places? Have similar reactions to change led to rising authoritarian tendencies and other kinds of radical movements in other places? Or what does that look like from a perspective outside of the United States, in your view?
Yeah, great question. In my book called Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies, I study 7 different countries. I go to 19th and early 20th century France and Germany, and then I go to contemporary Russia, Hungary, Poland, Brazil, and the US. And I mean, I really think you can see very similar patterns in all 7 countries over whatever time period you want to examine. I think it's interesting. One of the things I found interesting was you kind of have a paradigm that goes like this. We are the true nation, says a group of people. We are or were the majority, Protestant or Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. We had a partnership so tight with the church that was established that you could not even really tell where the politics, where the political regime started and the church ended, right? So a throne altar combo platter that benefited a certain kind of majority or plurality population in the country. And so worry about that giving way to something else can be traced to, the early modern period. I mean, you can see it in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. As soon as you introduce pluralism of ideas, loosen up religious liberty, stop killing people who are understood to be heretics or schismatics, provide citizenship for people who are not Christian or not Protestant or not Catholic or not Orthodox, provide equal rights for Jews. all of that is, that's 19th, 18th, early 20th century stuff. And Christians saying we got to get our country back. All these changes are nauseating. It's terrifying. So that's the story I tell in the France and Germany chapters, and both of them end up leading to fascism. The Pétain regime, the Vichy regime in France, and the Nazi regime.
Yeah.
And so when you study that, my dissertation was on the Nazis and the Holocaust. And so when you studied that and then come to the modern period, the historical parallels are really, I mean, they're just so obvious. A population that had the power to define the real, the true, the good, the right, God's will, and so on, has to share that power, hates it, pushes back hard. And democracy then becomes a problem because democracy is the vehicle by which pluralism is blessed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And when you get enough pluralism, routinely votes go against what you think should happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And institutions end up passing laws, or judges end up making decisions that a significant now minority of the population believes to be outrageous. But there's nothing quite like the energy of an aggrieved former majority licking its wounds and demanding to take power back. And I think that story is visible in all 7 of the countries that I studied in the book. And I think that it applies to the story that you're telling as well.
I'm interested in what you said about, the real, the true, the actual, the right, the good. And there's almost a sense among those who want the kind of revenge and vengeance that you're telling and discussing, that if we control those things, we control the country, we control the people, we control all the levers of government. And I'm wondering if you see trends in some of the case studies that you've mentioned in terms of conspiracy theories in Weimar Germany about a stab in the back, and that's why Hitler is the man that will save us. Conspiracy theories in Vichy France. I think we could point to contemporary Poland and Brazil as places where we see some of those on the rise. How does that look when you look away and then you look back at the United States and you see the ways that so many conspiracy theories thrive among those that have the revenge fantasy that you're naming?
The privilege of epistemological power is something that I think comes up in both of our books. The power to define what is real and what is right, and to enforce it in authoritarian structures like K through 12 schools where the church approves the curriculum, say.
Yeah.
Or the state, the leader with the bishops or the whoever whispering in his ear says, this is what you should teach about sexuality, this is what you should teach about race, about the proper ordering of the family, that kind of thing. And I think it's now clear that the loss of that power and having to deal with a world in which you've got some authorities over here teaching something very different. And in other words, you have a pluralism. You don't have an epistemological monopoly anymore. You have to send your kids to a school where maybe some teacher is telling this story and another teacher is telling that story, and or there's no shared story, and the Christian story that you're so sure of is only one story. I think that's not only enraging to people, it's fundamentally disorienting.
Yeah.
And so if somebody comes along like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Putin in Russia, or Orban in Hungary, or Trump here, and says, listen, this is not right. We know what is true. We know what is right. Put me in charge, and I'll be sure that the true and the right prevail again. Your side, your truth prevails again. They don't even have to believe it. The leader doesn't have to believe it, but the leader just has to know how to leverage that anxiety and to promise, and then eventually to deliver, if possible, what is promised.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a thought about, you mentioned my personal story.
Yeah.
And so I converted in Southern California, and I always understood myself to be countercultural. Here I am, a college student in 1999. All right. And the story I told myself was, hey, look, the world is always going to tell the different stories that you just mentioned. The world doesn't tell my story. That's why I'm a countercultural Christian, right? And it felt kind of fun because I was like, it's us against the world. It felt good to be kind of like outsiders fighting the dominant secular powers. Okay, great. And so I'll be honest, when I looked around at people around me who had been Christians and in Christian families for generations, it took me a while to realize their feelings were different. They were looking around thinking, why don't we still have the power? Like, we need to get that back. And I remember looking at some of my elders and thinking, I actually don't want that. I want to be these countercultural, right? We're going to be Paul in the Roman Empire, right? And they looked at me like, nah, no, I don't think so. This is a godly country. And I remember the tension there. And I just, I'm wondering for you how that looks, because you teach in the South, right? Spent so much time in the South. I've lived and taught in the South. There's a different paradigm, I think, culturally there. Is that part of it? Is it just an expectation that our story is the story? And if you disorient that, we're going to just lash out. And what happened to the idea of being Paul in the Roman Empire and saying, we're going to tell our story, even though they don't want us to, kind of thing.
That is such a good point. I was a born again convert in the late 70s in the DC suburb of Vienna, Virginia. And I was in a great public school system, but it was relentlessly secular. And all the kids around me seemed to be relentlessly secular. And I also thrilled in making lists of all my friends who I was going to convert and all of that, right? And the idea was, we are different. We born again Christian types are really different. We didn't expect to be in charge, but we knew we had a mission. This was Northern Virginia. It was a very secularized slice of the DC area.
I mean, Vienna is almost, for those who don't know, right? Vienna is DC, and it's like 10 miles from DC. It's not,
right.
It's not right. Richmond. It's not Norfolk. It's not,
That's right. So the real Virginians said we were not really Virginia. We were something different. But what I didn't really know was that once you get out of areas like that and go to small town, like I taught in West Tennessee for 11 years, there you have a small town version of throwing an altar.
Yeah.
You have, the mayors speaking at the prayer breakfast and the city council meetings. Some Baptist pastor is saying a prayer in Jesus' name, and whatever supposed church-state boundaries there are blown right through on a regular basis at the local high school, unless somebody challenges it, And so I would say that kind of a Christendom, God and country, flag and cross mingling in rural and small town South was probably in some ways very little affected by the Supreme Court decisions of the 60s. It just kind of kept on going. And so I think a lot of those folks, people from those communities, are the ones who never did accept the changes of the 60s and who organized politically to turn them back if possible. That was the moral majority, Jerry Falwell, people like that, right? But the story you tell also is that long before that, it was not just about cultural symbols of Christianity. It was also about white supremacism, racism. School integration is at the heart of this story. The women's movement and women in the workforce and the challenging of the patriarchal families at the heart of the story. But yes, that spirit of we can be joyfully countercultural seems to have given way to a spirit of we have to take this country back by any means necessary.
Yeah. That's what I think, when people ask me what's the shift between 2000 and 2020, I say, look, I think there was a strain of evangelicalism that was like, when I learned purity culture, for example, in the 90s, the idea was we're going to swim upstream and we're going to not be like everyone else. We're going to be, people who remain abstinent because that's countercultural, right? It was a way to get teenagers to be rebels, right? Hey, teenagers like to be rebels. Let's be rebels.
Play the rebel
right?
card, yeah.
And now I think it's gone from we can't wait for Jesus to come back to save us from this evil world to we're going to dominate and control the world so that Jesus will come back. And, we can talk about a shift. We could talk about a shift from premillennial eschatology to postmillennial, right? And
Postmillennial right there, yeah.
Yeah. But I firmly believe, that most people in practice, maybe not in profession, like in the way they profess their thinking about the end times, but in practice, when I hear Sean Foyt, when I hear the New Apostolic Reformation guys, when I hear others, I hear a post-millennial eschatology that says the reason we're on earth is to dominate the earth for God. And then God will come back and reward his faithful servants and warriors, and it'll be peace on earth. It used to be, like you said, I used to do something very similar. It used to be, I got to make a list of all the people in my life I'm going to get saved, because I could wake up tomorrow and here's Jesus. And I remember thinking, I'm not going to run for mayor. I'm not going to run for state legislature. I'm going to go out and convert everyone I can find, because we're all going to be like gone tomorrow, next week, a year from now. I just don't feel like that's in the ether anymore. I feel like what's in the ether now is dominate, control in the name of Jesus, because that's our mission, and there's a shift there, I think, in an eschatology and a political theology working together, if that makes, any sense.
Big picture, as an ethicist, I have felt that, and it's more clear to me now, that Christian political ethics is built on a pretty unstable foundation, in a sense that the biblical materials can lead you in a lot of different directions. You do a little Joshua and Jericho and David and Goliath and a little Revelation, you can end up doing the Jericho March thing that you wrote about in your book, or Jesus tramping in the blood of the enemy in Revelation. That's always been available to be used for holy war type stuff, right?
Yeah.
Also, I try to argue in my book that support for democracy, the long, slow process of democracy, and winning some and losing some and accepting an imperfect world, there's a certain theology that is required for that, a certain patience.
Yep.
That it hasn't always been part of the way Christians approach the world, right?
Yeah.
A certain acceptance of loss, of sinfulness, and yet goodness, of diversity, of intractable differences among human beings, that you negotiate and say, for one more year, we will not kill each other over these differences. We're going to continue to be in community together.
Yeah.
But as you said, the 60 years of holy war rhetoric and cold Civil War rhetoric, and now some people getting out their guns, and maybe it's not just cold Civil War anymore, and Proud Boys and the people on January 6th, the patience and the nonviolence and the norms of civilization and living in a democratic society, it's just eroded a lot.
When I think back to the 90s, I don't think there was any patience there either, but the energy was spent in, we got to save. I mean, this was my experience. I got to save everybody so they can go to heaven when Jesus returns. And I think there's a similar crisis narrative. It's just now about political domination rather than getting everyone saved, right? So I'm not sure that the lack of patience has changed, at least in American evangelicalism as I see it. I just feel like it's being shaped by a different story of what needs to happen in order to carry out your mission for God on earth, if you know what I mean.
I think that the hope that evangelism and missions, remember those old words, evangelism, missions, and disciple making, that would be how Christians engage the world, and that would change the world. That has been lost because it hasn't yielded the fruit that people wanted. And I think that had already been lost by the time of the moral majority. We got to take back power by getting the GOP, right? But then, as you show in your book, when the victories are not actually as forthcoming as you want them to be, then maybe even electoral politics is not going to be sufficient. Maybe we'll need to do some other things too. And that's the moment I think we find ourselves in.
So we have an election coming up, right? A year and 2 months. And the way I look at it is January 6th gets more popular as time goes on. If you look at statistics, people like Sam Perry are always putting out studies that show us that, Paul Jupe and others. Hey, the more the more months that pass, the more people in the country seem to think January 6th was legitimate, okay, not a big deal, one of those. The guy that incited it and has now been indicted 4 times is getting about 60% of the vote in the GOP primary at the moment, according to polls. So when people ask me where are we at, I say, look, I know you don't want to hear this anymore because you're tired. I know you want to go back to normal life. A lot of folks are not political junkies. They don't want to spend all day trying to figure out what's happening. But we are still in a place where 2024 is a matter of kind of yes or no when it comes to the idea of democracy in the United States. And I think Trump has shown us what a second term will look like. He's already, basically, if you pay attention, he's already forecasted a unitary executive theory, an approach to government funds, relationships to Congress, judiciary. He's going to gut the State Department. I mean, it is going to look like Orban's Hungary from the inside in terms of dismantling democracy from within, with probably people who are a little smarter and more adept than in term number 1. You know, Jared Kushner won't have 88 roles in the next administration if Trump is president. And so here's my analogy, and then I'll throw it to you, is just it feels like one of those moments where the hard part for those of us who want to maintain something like democracy in America is you have to continually exercise it. You don't go to the gym once. You have to always just sort of keep up with your routine. And it kind of feels like, you know, if you take, you know, if you just sort of say, well, I'm going to take a year off, I'll work out in a year. You know, what you started is no longer there. The flip side of it is they only need one, right? They just need one to get through. If Trump gets through the second term, I really think he could just finish what he started in terms of dismantling democracy. So the uphill battle is we got to keep exercising, even though it's a kind of perpetual practice. Whereas if he can get in once, there's a chance it's a kind of poison pill that will last generations, if not forever, for this country. How do you see it? Do I sound like look like from your view?
By the way, everybody needs to read your book, because when you talk about some of the stuff that's happening, the people turning January 6th into a mythic event, the people who are turning Ashley Babbitt into a martyr, who are turning the battle flags of January 6th into relics, that is so Hitler Push 1923. It's unbelievable. Now, what should have happened in Germany is when Hitler tried to overthrow the government, he should have been barred from running for office for life. Same thing should have happened with Trump. It might still happen. Doesn't look like it, though. The Senate had the opportunity in 2021 and passed on it. So the fact that an insurrectionist has a chance to run for president again and has the strong support of the Republicans, even if he runs from jail, is astonishing. So our democracy is still up for grabs. And we can't take a year off. I do think the fact that the Electoral College is still functioning, and some of the states that are the pivotal swing states are in the hands of Democratic governors and legislatures right now rather than Republican, and that the vice president of the United States at that time will be a Democrat. In other words, some of these white knuckle, do we have the institutions in place to prevent a coup? It looks actually a little bit better today than it did on January 5th, 2021.
Yeah.
But for our democracy to be that fragile that you actually have to look at every election as a near-death experience for democracy, it really shows you where we are, Brad. So to the question, how should we think about this presidential election? We have a possibility of a demise of democracy if somebody who has learned the lessons of Vladimir Putin and Viktor Orban and knows how to hold the levers of power much better than he did 4 years ago, if he ends up in the White House again, well, one thing he would do is he would pardon all of those January 6th people, and they'd all be ready to form a paramilitary and ready to, you know, in other words, they would be ready to rock and roll one more time, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we would have another election that would matter 4 years after that or 4 years after that.
Yep.
We might end up having a dynastic succession from Trump to Trump Jr. Who knows what would happen, right? In other words, this is legitimately a worry. So we're writing books to try to say, hey, Christians, if you ever really believed in democracy, now's the time. And if you think that the concerns about the right wing and some of the metastatic developments there are hysterical, just read your book, Brad. Read what's happening in the American Redoubt up in Idaho and eastern Washington. Read, or just listen to these preachers who are out and about doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
So I'm so tired of this. I know we're all tired of this, but this is a crisis. I fear more bloodshed, Brad.
Mm-hmm.
I fear serious threats to the election again, more threats to election workers, more intimidation. And we have to stand up for what's right. So thank you for your book. I do encourage everybody to read Preparing for War, and I'm glad to be working shoulder to shoulder with you for a better version of Christianity and for the survival of democracy in this country. So
no, well, same to you. And I appreciate the historical nature of your work. And the case that I want to jump into when we have more time is Poland. I feel like there's a lot of folks in my orbit who talk a lot. I mean, obviously there's reason to talk about Brazil. We all know the kind of comparisons with Nazi Germany. I think thinking about various iterations of Orban's Hungary and how that has been a model for the right in this country is interesting. But when I talk to folks, not a lot of them realize what's happened in Poland. I remember traveling in Poland in the early 2000s, and man, it was a sense of like sunrise there, democracy on the horizon, a new generation, and it's a different story these days. And I love to nerd out on that at some point.
Yeah, I like to talk to somebody who can nerd out country by country with me. I mean, it's heavily Catholic inflected, counter pluralist, counter liberal, and by the way, the anti-LGBTQ dimension,
exactly.
all of these everywhere.
Yeah,
it's always, anytime appears to be a good time to beat up on queer people as part of the this reactionary strategy. And so we need to continue to stand in solidarity. And by the way, that's happening in our country as well. A very dangerous time. Very dangerous.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you, Brad. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, David.